for the first band like that. It was all about rejecting glamour. It was all about, we're just gonna go out on stage in our jeans and t-shirts and be sweaty and drunk and play fast and loud and aggressive. And very quickly this kind of mutated, like spread around the world. And there were thrash scenes in all over the country, all over the world. There are German thrash bands like Creator and Destruction and things. Now the other big influence, and this is the first band to really be part of to really define extreme metal. 1982, the first record by a band called Venom from England came out. Now Venom were a three-piece like Motorhead, and they were considered part of this new wave of British heavy metal. But they weren't technically that great musicians. But they were like, well, we can't play virtuoso solos and things, but we can play fast and loud and hard and just be more in your face than any other band around. The name of this talk was Welcome to Hell, and that's the name of that first Venom album. It was the first extreme metal record. Really, if metal starts with Black Sabbath, extreme metal starts with Venom. So, your Metallicas and your Megadeths and your Slayers and stuff are all fans of Venom, but better musicians, taking that same aggression but playing it more technically. Venom also took the occult and Satanism and things have always been part of the metal lyrical sounds and things like that, where Venom took that further than anybody else had at the time. Black Sabbath, that song Black Sabbath, Ozzy Osbourne sings about, this figure in black that stands before me and things, but he's kind of singing about it, it's like, he's kind of afraid of this thing. Venom is like, we're the creatures in black. You should be afraid of us. We're in league with Satan. We're on the devil's side. So they were the first to be like, we're totally embracing this, and they did it, it was tongue-in-cheek and meant for shock value. Basically, they wanted to be the band that every parent would be afraid of. The first Venom records didn't sell that well. They were kind of considered a joke in the new wave British heavy metal scene. Their second album was called Black Metal, which later became the name of an entire subgenre of this stuff. But there was the people who were in the scene who did like Venom really liked Venom. And they took that influence and was like, we want to keep going with what they're doing. So you had, in Switzerland, a band called Hellhammer. In Sweden, Bathory. All of these bands were playing incredibly fast. They were all considered part of this, by this point, these bands were all considered thrash. But they were more primitive, not very well produced, like totally lo-fi thrash bands. Also, none of these bands were well received critically at all, even in the metal press. Like Kerrang gave the first Hellhammer records terrible reviews and said, this isn't even music. But more and more fans gravitated towards this stuff and there was a big thing, pre-internet, metal was all about trading tapes and networking and a very DIY thing. You get these metal magazines and there'd be addresses in the back for pen pals, and you could write and trade, you have a demo tape for a band, and somebody else had other bands, and you trade tapes through the mail. So like some of these bands, by the time their first record came out, everybody already knew all their songs because they had already had, like the real metal crowd all had the demo tapes already and already heard all this. And by the time when the record came out, it's like, oh, now it's just like on vinyl and it's a little better produced. And it's not like a 27th generation cassette that sounds like shit. Another big thing that Motorhead introduced, which is important to the sound of extreme metal, is the double bass drum. If I can pull this up real quick. Raul, is this on?
It is on.
It doesn't seem to be playing.
Oh, hold on.
There. That's a double bass. That became huge in extreme metal. All the thrash bands had that kind of drum sound. They also had like the gruff, raspy vocals that came from Lemmy and Venom. Slayer took all the satanic imagery and things that Venom had, played it even better, like with more skill and more in your face. The album Rain and Blood was huge. It was totally stripped down production. Rick Rubin just put everything right there. There was very little reverb on it. It was just like they wanted the sound to be like punching you. Another thing Venom introduced that's important is the idea, there are three members of Venom all use pseudonyms to add more mystique to their presentation. The bass player and vocalist Conrad Lant took on the name Kronos. Tony Bray, the drummer, became Abaddon, and Jeff Dunn, the guitarist, became Mantis. And this is something that still goes on, especially with black metal bands today, where everybody comes up with, there's like these, it's kind of goofy, but it's kind of cool. It adds this like sense that the bands are somehow larger than life and like outside of normality. You know, you don't really think of the guys in Immortal being like normal guys who go to the laundromat and, you know, hang out, even though you know that that's exactly what they are. But when you're watching an Immortal show, they're like these larger than life characters on stage playing this music. Some of that comes out of Kiss being a huge influence on the Norwegian black metal scene. Almost all the bands in the Norwegian black metal scene got interested in music through Kiss when they were like preteens. There were Kiss trading cards that were all over Norway in the 70s. So they were already like attracted to that kind of dressing up kind of thing. You know, they just wanted to take it more seriously. Dina Weinstein, who is a DePaul sociology professor, she wrote one of the first serious books about metal in the 80s. Actually, it was the early 90s when her first book came out. She talked about the rise and growth of that new wave of British heavy metal. It's kind of what I was saying earlier, but she said it was the maturity of heavy metal before branching out into all the various subcultures. It was predominantly male, but it was neither sexist or macho. It was predominantly white, but it was not racist. Sex and race were treated within the scene as irrelevant. There was, unfortunately, a strong trend for homophobia in some of the metal scenes at the time. But it was, being political in the metal scene was almost considered like a taboo thing. Like you just weren't supposed to talk about, like punk was political, metal wasn't. Pardon me, I'm consulting my notes. Another part of the punk scene that influenced the extreme metal scene enormously was a band from England called Discharge. This is a little sample of Discharge. Discharge were considered part of the punk scene. They were very political. And they were like a huge, like one of my favorite bands in the 80s. But if you hear this, you'll see that there is much more of the guitars are much more metallic than anything that the Clash or the Sex Pistols or the Damned or anything. So they were like the punk band that metal people liked. Motorhead were the metal band that punk people liked. Thrash, like I said, spread all over the world. There were bands like Voivod from Canada, Hellhammer, which evolved into Celtic Frost in Switzerland, Sepultura in Brazil. And then the San Francisco scene was kind of where the thrash scene really took on its hold in the United States. And a big band in that scene in San Francisco that's really important to this story is a band called Possessed. Possessed took a lot of the same imagery from Slayer and Venom, a lot of the satanic kind of look and attitude. But this is a little bit of Possessed. It's getting even less melodic. So this is where thrash is starting to evolve into death metal. So Possessed were still considered a thrash band, but they're kind of on that fence where they're kind of becoming death metal. And death metal, basically the two places where death metal became huge were Florida, where it's really hot, and Sweden, where it's really cold. So extreme weather creates extreme music. The Florida scene gravitated around, both of these scenes largely gravitated around specific recording studios. In Florida, Morris Sound Studios was a new recording studio that had opened, and they were like the first people to figure out how to record all this stuff so it made some kind of sense. It's so fast and heavy and distorted that if you don't know what you're doing, it just becomes this blur, the kind of blur. And so Steve Morris at Morris Sound kind of understood how to record these bands. So Florida became like a hotspot. So like bands were moving to Florida to form their to bring their death metal bands there because they wanted to record at this studio. Same thing happened in Sweden with a studio called Sunlight. So you had Florida bands, like there was a band called Death. Chuck Schuldiner is probably the biggest figure in the, I've been liking hearing Chuck Schuldin's name, yeah. They were probably the first pure death metal band. I mean, the name Death. Although the word death metal had been around, but Possessed called their first demo tape death metal. But the band Death used this term, and it was basically like more faster changes of tempo and key and things like really all over the place, like where thrash was kind of more, it built and got more intense, but it kind of went in a straightforward line where death metal would kind of jump all over the place and get like just crazier. Simultaneous to the development of death metal, from the punk scene, you had grindcore. These sound very similar. Napalm Death were the first big grindcore band. So they came more out of the punk scene. So they were a little more, they were more political in their lyrical content. They had the same kind of guitar tone and speed. Like this is, I played this earlier, but this is a song called "You Suffer" by Napalm Death. This is the entire song. That was Napalm Death. There are actually 4 words, if you want to sing along. But another thing that Napalm Death introduced, like at least gave a name to it, is something called the blast beat. Blast beats are really fast, like one. You're the drummer, right? You want to explain a blast beat? You can probably do it better than I can.
Yeah, real fast, like alternating machine guns. Yeah, machine gun fire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this became like, it had been around in bands, like hardcore bands would have them, like the band DRI on there had blast beats, things. But Napalm Death kind of perfected it and gave it a name. And grindcore and death metal both introduced lots of, like blast beats became a big part of those scenes, where there's really not a lot of blast beats in most thrash music. But when you get into your death metal and grindcore and your black metal and things, then you start hearing a lot more blast beats coming in. It's almost like just like a pummeling punctuation to the music. It's it's also something that if it's not recorded right, it can sound really shitty. Like it almost just sounds like a typewriter. But if it's recorded really well, it sounds powerful and intense. So thrash has rejected glam. It's brought in these like more extreme lyrical contents and things, and death metal has gone to do that as well. And at this point, early on in the 80s, all these terms are still kind of being defined. So they get used interchangeably. Like a band might be, somebody might call them a death metal band, somebody else might call them a black metal band. Nobody really, they weren't like hard and fast rules about what these things were. As time went on, these kind of became clearer what they. Basically, initially, black metal just meant any music with heavy satanic lyrical content. It didn't really matter what it musically sounded like. A band like Mercyful Fate were considered part of the early black metal scene. Now, if you listen to Mercyful Fate, it's got a much more traditional, like almost Judas Priest-like guitar sound. It's got that high-pitched wailing, kind of taking what Rob Halford and Bruce Dickinson have been doing to like this weirdo, like ridiculous extreme. But the singer for Mercyful Fate was a practice. He kind of took the Anton LaVey type of Satanism seriously. And so they were definitely considered an early black metal band, even though they don't sound anything like Dark Throne or Burzum or Mayhem or some of the bands that we'll get into in a few minutes.